Hello everyone, welcome to back our podcast series about language learning strategies and self-regulated language learning in Colombia, English as a foreign language context.
In the previous episode, our classmate talked about how useful language learning strategies and self-regulated language learning can be in language learning and discuss if these approaches really work. They also talk about what research said about the students' English level and the students where these strategies can work well or not work well in English as a foreign language context.
And today, in episode 4, we want to focus on the reality. What is the actual Colombian EFL context and the challenges that teachers and students face every day? Because honestly, many theories sound very effective on paper, but when we look at the real classroom in Colombia, the situation is more complex. Teachers usually have to adapt constantly depending on the students, the school conditions, and even the amount of time for English classes.
Yeah, so we'll talk about issues like low exposure to English, overcrowded classrooms, limited resources too, and how these situations affect the implementation of learning strategies and self-regulation in a Colombian context.
And we'll also reflect on an important question. What is actually possible in Colombia classroom? And what remains more ideal than practical?
I think one of the biggest challenges in Colombia is the lack of exposure to English outside the classroom. In many regions, students rarely listen to English in their daily lives, unless they actively search for it online or through music and movies.
Definitely, in many cases, students only hear or use English during class time. Once the lesson finishes, they return to an environment where Spanish is the only language spoken.
That's well. And according to Oxford, language learning strategies work better when learners can use the language frequently and meaningfully. But if students only practice English for a few hours per week, progress becomes really slower. And also I think that this can make students feel disconnected from the language because English becomes something academic instead of something useful in daily life.
Yeah, and in fact, that also affects confidence. During my educational practice, I noticed students that were afraid of speaking English because they felt they didn't have enough practice. So they had fear of making a mistake and be fooled by their mates. For that reason, students prefer to avoid exposure and being into their comfort zone.
The same thing happened in my observation class. A student understands grammar exercise, but when the teacher asked simple speaking question, many become nervous or switch back to Spanish immediately. I think this happens because they are not used to communicating in English in real situation. They are afraid of making mistake or being judged by their classmates, so they prefer to stay silent instead of trying to speak.
And I think that software is connected to how English is sometimes taught. In some classrooms, students focus too much on grammar rules and writing exercise, but they don't have enough opportunity for real communication.
And that changes everything. It's difficult for teachers to monitor individual learning or give personalized feedback. In many cases, teachers have to divide their attention between too many students at the same time. So, it becomes harder to identify individual difficulties or support each learner in a more personal way.
Exactly. Theories about SRLL often explain that students should plan, monitor, and evaluate their own learning. But teachers usually need time to guide those processes, and with so many students, it's really difficult. Sometimes teachers are doing their best to just maintain the order and finish the lesson plan. So, even if they know strategy-based learning is important, they may not always have the condition to apply it effectively in every class.
Yeah, the thing you mentioned reminds me to Vygotsky theory of scaffolding. Ideally, teachers support students progressively through interaction and reduce support as students improve. But overcrowded classrooms make that difficult because not all students progress at the same way, and there's no enough time nor space to apply a correct use of strategies.
And we also have to consider limited resources. Some schools, especially those in rural areas, lack internet access, speaker and projector, or sufficient material for communicative activities. In some classrooms, a teacher only have a whiteboard and a book, so they need to constantly adapt their lesson. Sometimes students want more dynamic activities, but the school condition make that difficult to achieve.
So sometimes teachers want to implement innovative strategies, but the context limits what they can realistically do. Imagine trying to develop speaking activities where every student participate actively. It becomes very difficult for teachers to give individual feedback or monitor learning strategies effectively.
So, how do these challenges affect language learning strategies and self-regulated language learning in real classroom situations?
That's a very good question, Mahicol. Students may become more dependent on the teacher because they don't always have the opportunities to practice independently. And in some cases, students are not used because of the traditional teaching methods. So, developing self-regulation can take a lot of time and motivation from teachers and learners.
Also, on the other hand, strategies like autonomous listening, practice, reflective journals, or online learning tasks may not work equally for all students, due to everyone have their own preferred language learning strategies.
I remember reading Siderman's idea about self-regulation. He explained that learners should set goals and reflect on their progress. But in reality, many students are more focused on a grade or passing exam. They don't always see English as something useful for their personal lives. So, motivation can decrease easily, especially when learning becomes repetitive or difficult.
That comment reflects the reality of many Colombian students. Learning English often depends not only on personal effort, but also on access to resources, technology, and supporting environments.
Okay, and honestly, teachers also experience pressure. They often have to finish curriculum objective quickly, which leaves little time for reflective or strategy-based learning activities.
So, do you think these strategies work in our context, and which ones do you recommend for students and teachers?
Wow, those are very, very interesting questions. But sadly, I think we don't have enough time to talk about such an important topic right now. So we will invite our audience to listen our next episode totally focused on make your rethinking learning.